All right. Hey, welcome everyone to our continued discussion of who is my neighbor. And as we begin, I'll introduce myself. I'm Pastor Matt Paul from First Presbyterian Church. And we are talking about the intersection, if you will, between mental illness, homelessness, and the criminal justice system. So we're joined tonight by members from the criminal justice field in our county, in our community. And I'm going to turn it over to Don Cheesebro to introduce our guests, but I'll begin with a word of prayer. I would ask actually if you're not one of our presenters, mute, and then later on when we get to the question and answer period, you can certainly unmute then. So, all right, let's pray. Gracious God, we thank you for the opportunity that we have to spend this time together to learn a little bit more. So I pray that you would open our hearts to receive the information and wisdom of one another, that together we can better see who our neighbors are and learn how we can serve our neighbors in our community. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. Don?
Okay, let's start with Sheriff Benedict. He's already told us he's retiring after quite a few years. Been sheriff since '06, and he's been in the Clallam County Police Department since '95. So that's a long career and a second career. You can see the plane behind him was indicative, I think, of his first career. Not the planes you flew, I don't think, but anyway. I think I'll keep it brief and well, let's see, I guess I jotted down here that he was a patrol officer and a sergeant and an undercover narcotics officer before becoming sheriff. So Sheriff, go ahead and take it away.
Well, thank you. I'm going to keep my remarks brief. With me is my Chief Criminal Deputy, Brian King, my Chief Corrections Deputy, Don Wenzel, and then I'm especially happy to have Dr. Lindsay Monahan with us, and they're all going to give their perspectives. And I'm going to keep to your email, which basically said we want to save 15, 20, maybe even half hour for questions. So I'm going to try to start at, I would call, the 30,000 foot view. And I want to start by commenting that we're going to talk about the intersection of mental illness and homelessness. And I'd like to add another component to that, and that would be drug addiction. And I want to talk about, I talked with Brian King earlier today, and we can start with our point in time count, which over the years has varied anywhere from 500 to 800 homeless. And of that, let me first take care of the low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit is the single mother with some children, let's say, or a family with some children that don't have proper shelter, and they can either have lost their homes or they can arrive here unsheltered. Wonderful groups, church groups, as well as Serenity House and other organizations jump on them, and you won't see them living in their cars under an underpass, nor will you see them in a tent. Another large category that's in this point in time count are high school age kids that are probably more correctly would be they're homeless, but they're sheltered, and they tend to couch surf. They'll stay with friends, with neighbors, sometimes with some other groups. And once again, this group is in no danger of either starving to death or of being harmed by exposure in the winter. So that leaves us with a group that we deal with, which is probably the homeless folks that you'll see hanging around the Salvation Army, or that will be in tents along the Discovery Trail, or in tents around in Port Angeles. This group, and I'm going to use a number of about 95%. 95% of this group have drug addictions, and probably even more than that, are also mentally ill. And it's somewhat of a vicious circle because Dr. Monahan could probably talk to this better than I, but their mental illness is often brought on by the drug use. And I want to say this: what we're seeing, actually, if it weren't for the middle class, I should say, and even upper class drug users, particularly opioids, we wouldn't have a problem with the homeless using them because they're essentially subsidized. But our problem with drugs, particularly opiates, goes throughout our society. And we have so many, just like we have functioning alcoholics, we have functional opiate addicts. And they're the ones that are driving the engine in terms of purchasing them and making their availability. So it would be a mistake to think that if we could just stop drug dealers to the homeless, that we would solve that problem. We wouldn't. The opiate problem would be with us. So having said all that, let me start with Brian King. He's going to talk a little bit about the criminal aspect of this group that I'm talking of, and this is the group that we experience with, as to how we deal with them and how they wind up in jail. Brian?
Thank you, Sheriff. By way of introduction, my name is Brian King. I'm the Chief Deputy with the Sheriff's Office. I command the Patrol Division in our investigative division at the Sheriff's Office. I'm also the commander of the Olympic Peninsula Narcotics Enforcement Team, which is commonly known as OPNET. I would like to start by talking a little bit about really the drugs in our community right now first, and where I see that intersecting with our homeless population. And so just a little bit of history that I want to talk about first is in the late 2000s, about 2007, our country was facing a true methamphetamine usage crisis. There was a lot of methamphetamine in our communities, a lot of paranoia. It was driving a lot of property crime. And so as a country, we decided to outlaw a lot of those precursors, those ingredients that go into synthesizing methamphetamine and delivering it to our streets. Most of the methamphetamine at that time was manufactured right here in the United States, and the primary ingredient of that was ephedrine. So when ephedrine became essentially regulated by the federal government, their cartels south of the border, Mexico, they had to get creative. They knew that we had a demand issue here in the United States. We are the largest consumer of illicit drugs in the world. And so the Mexican cartels became creative, and what they came to study and provide was this method called this method of production of methamphetamine, which is called the P2p method, which is essentially using a lot of other industrial type of ingredients in order to manufacture methamphetamine. So by 2010, 2012, the P2p method of methamphetamine, we lost a lot of the home manufactured methamphetamine, and it turned to this type of methamphetamine. So methamphetamine is a neurotoxin. It's extremely, extremely dangerous to it essentially causes a cerebral catastrophe in people. So with that P2p method, we see a lot of paranoia, drug-induced schizophrenia. And a lot of that, in my opinion, and what has driven what we see today here in Port Angeles is in our communities, is really the cause and effect, the cause of that methamphetamine usage, and the fact that it's still one of the most abused drugs. It is the most abused drugs in the United States. And so the prevalence of methamphetamine in our community, along with fentanyl and heroin, is unprecedented at this time. And we, as sheriff's deputies and police officers that are patrolling our streets every day, encounter folks under the influence of this. And so when I look at homelessness, a lot of times we characterize it by, like the sheriff was saying, some of us may view it as, the family who maybe had lost their jobs and can't pay for their rent. What we are seeing today in our streets is really addiction. It's addiction that has led to this cerebral catastrophe in people's brains. And now we really have truly a mental health crisis as well that's really derived from all of the drug uses that we're seeing. For example, our narcotics task force is purchasing methamphetamine at 25% of the cost that we were 10 years ago. Traditionally, we'd be purchasing a pound of methamphetamine at about $6,000. We're now purchasing it as about as low as $2,000. The same goes for heroin that's coming into our community. 2 years ago, we were purchasing heroin at about $12,000 a pound, and we've done a couple controlled buys here recently where it's as low as $6,000 a pound. 7 years ago, when I took over as the commander of the drug task force, we would go out and we'd celebrate the purchase of an ounce of methamphetamine or an ounce of heroin because that's what was available to us. Now, most of our purchases are in the pound quantities. And so the legislature hasn't helped us much there. With the Blake decision and then the legislation following the Blake decision is essentially decriminalize simple possession. So that's made it very, very difficult and really tied our hands as far as our enforcement efforts go out on the street in the control of these drugs into our community. Step away from the drugs and the conversation I just had about the drugs is most of law enforcement's contact with the homeless folks in our community really has to do with trespass and theft. Theft being one of the drivers because the theft of property from other people is how folks that are homeless, don't have jobs, fuel their drug habits. We also deal quite frequently with trespass. So folks who are, essentially don't have places to go, whether it's business stoops, parking lots, park and rides. Deputies, police officers are getting called to a lot of these locations and called by citizens because they're nervous about the presence of some of these homeless folks. Some of it can be very aggressive panhandling, especially in the summer months when our weather gets better here in the county. We do get a lot of calls of aggressive panhandling on our streets. Dawn, do you have any, if Dawn would like to comment as to our jail population, since the COVID epidemic, our jail population, as we've had to step back, our numbers in the jail. And so traditionally our jail, at the time of COVID had about 120 offenders in it. Today we're running at about 60. Is that correct, Don?
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Our jail was built, and I don't know how many of you actually know, we do have a jail in Port Angeles. We're not associated with the prison. There is a lot of people that were surprised that there is a jail at the courthouse.
Don, I think it might be helpful if you explain the difference between jail and prison for people.
Oh, yes. So our jail was built in 1984. Normally, the difference between jail and prison is jails are usually either pre-sentenced or pre-trial individuals, or they are post-conviction with people serving less than a year in on a misdemeanor. If someone's sentenced to a felony and they have over 365 days, they go to the state prison. Our jail, like I said, was built 40 years ago. It has 120 beds right now as the rated capacity. Like Chief King said, March of 2020, we had to implement COVID restrictions. This is a concerted effort across the state with all the city and county jails, where with the help of Dr. Mark Stern, we have to isolate and quarantine individuals as they come through our system. So just so you know, our jail does hold male and female. We have to classify them between 3 different classifications. And then we also take into consideration anybody that's especially violent, or they have some protective custody issues, or whether they just have some mental illness that we can't keep them with the general population. We house them accordingly while they're pending their first court trial or court appearance. After their appearance, if they're not released, we have to move them to a general population and separate them appropriately. With the COVID restrictions, we have this extra layer of the onion where we have it used to be 14, now it's a 10-day isolation before they can go from this quarantine population to regular general population. To do this, we had to put on certain booking restrictions where we only take more serious crimes, felony warrants. We're not extraditing people. We're not bringing people back from other counties. This in turn has kept our population down to roughly 60%, which is roughly, we've been hitting about 70 individuals in jail. We are going through a construction right now, and this timing for the next month takes out another 20% of our beds because we have to close 4 cells at a time systematically for 2 weeks. So we are running, and I did a quick snapshot, we're at 61 people today. Of those 61 people, 6 are marked as homeless, 9 are marked as transient. It's the two different ways we keep track of people that are not listed with an address in Clallam County. That's just under 25% of our population. With these restrictions, we're still working with the State Department of Health. As you can see, the variants are changing. We're going to start working with our booking restrictions and try to accommodate this. It is frustrating for law enforcement as well as the public, private business owners, where they have these issues out there, and law enforcement's hands are tied on the fact that they can't bring them to our jail right now since we just don't have room. Regarding the homeless situation in our jail, it used to be they got released and then they walked out our door. We are working at having some sort of handoff or some sort of transition. We're in collaboration with Rediscovery, and they are working with our jail case transition manager in getting these people some sort of treatment or some sort of housing. So when they walk out our door, they've got something to look forward to, something that might help them, as opposed to just walking across the Safeway and shoplifting again. We are also collaborating with OPCC in expanding our, it used to be called MAT program, a medically assisted treatment program. Now it's, they changed it to SUD treatment. And we are working with them to bring in another transition manager to give them another soft handoff to some sort of treatment provider outside. So the way corrections started when I started in 1998 has changed a lot. It's less of the old school jail, more of treatment, rehabilitation, trying to keep them not to come back to our jail. And unfortunately, in my transition, I forgot to basically introduce myself. I've been with the Sheriff's Office since 1998 as a correction deputy. Moved through the different positions in the jail, promoted to sergeant in 2010, and then just last August, I was promoted to chief corrections deputy. And this can kind of transition to Dr. Monaghan. She kind of runs our medical department, which does have, I believe, 4 nurses right now. We contract through a third care provider called WellPath. So she can give you an idea on how our medical is helping them with the transition and what we're providing in the jail.
Thanks, Don. Yeah, so I'm Lindsay Monaghan. I am a family physician, and I wear a lot of different hats. I work at North Olympic Healthcare Network as a primary care provider. I do inpatient care and deliver babies at Olympic Medical Center. I'm also faculty for the residency program that we have here. And then lastly, I also am the medical director for the jail medical system. And I also work at the juvenile detention facility. One thing that Pastor Matt suggested that we go over is kind of like the historical background to mental health, how it kind of was treated decades past and how it sort of has led to an increase in populations in the jail system. And Sheriff Benedict, I know you have a good perspective on this too, so chime in if I say something wrong or something like that. But really in the 1970s, there was a move to deinstitutionalize mental illness. And yes, there was a lot going wrong in the institutions where they were treating the mentally ill at that time. But really those were dismantled without a backup plan. So really a lot of folks who were in long-term mental institutions just kind of wound up on the street. And as kind of been detailed between substance use and the crimes that can be associated with all of those things now end up in the correctional system without any great safety net to go to. And you can imagine a jail cell, even at the Clallam County Jail, where I am really proud to work with these wonderful folks, and I'm so thankful for the support Sheriff Benedict has for the medical care and mental health care of our patients, which I'm very anxious about you leaving in a year, and I hope we get someone as supportive as you. But you can imagine that even with the best care the nurses and I, and as supportive as the deputies are, a jail cell just is obviously not inpatient psychiatric care. And ultimately, the conditions are sort of what would exacerbate somebody's mental illness. But at the same time, if they're not safe to themselves or others, and we don't have some other safety net, this is kind of where folks end up. And yes, there's the convergence of mental illness and substance use is just, can't be overstated. Most folks with substance use disorders have significant trauma histories in their past or pre-existing mental illness that leads to the substance use. Nobody really wakes up one day and says like, wow, I'd really like to get hooked on methamphetamine and wind up homeless and sick. That's not how it happens. So, but then all those substances exacerbate the mental illness, and then they're just kind of caught in this spiral without enough community resources to help break that cycle. And even within the medical community still and general community, there's a lot of bias that we have against mental illness, against substance use disorders, where we just think like, gosh, why won't you snap out of it? I would never do that. Why are you making those terrible decisions, right? And when you stop and talk to people, they don't, they're caught in a cycle where things have really changed their brain chemistry, and especially in the frontal cortex, where you make all your really rational, smart decisions, start to diminish, and you're really kind of taking over what we call your lizard brain, your amygdala, the part that's sort of fight or flight, and just trying to survive, and you've lost that executive functioning. And with continued use, those cycles just become laminated in the brain. So also a lot of people who end up using drugs, because the body becomes dependent on them and you develop a tolerance, the same amount doesn't get you the same high or effect. And when you stop using, you get really sick and you feel like you have the worst flu of your life. And a lot of people just get stuck in the cycle of continuing to use because just to not be sick. And sometimes it's not even so much of getting the high anymore as it's just, I don't want to feel like I have the flu when I don't use these substances. So we're very lucky in our community to have some extensive treatment options for opioid use disorder, so heroin and fentanyl, and people who use pills like oxys and Percocets and things like that. And that's because we have a really effective medications that can break that cycle and can help the brain heal and break that pattern. And so medications like methadone, which has to be received at a methadone treatment program, or medicines like Suboxone, which you may have heard of, which can be prescribed in clinics. And one thing that people kind of get hung up on is like, oh gosh, that's exchanging one drug for another. But when you look at, well, what's life like on heroin or fentanyl, right? You're mixing up with really dangerous crowds. You might be committing crimes to get the money to get it. You're using dirty needles and getting hepatitis C and severe infections, and you can overdose and die. You can't keep a job. You can't keep a stable relationship. But when folks get on a medicine like Suboxone, it blocks and stimulates those receptors at the same time. So you can't go out and get high. You're not feeling that terrible flu when you stop using. People say, I just feel normal. I feel like my old self. You get your medicine from the doctor, so you're not mixing up with shady folks. You have a steady, you're going to get it from your doctor, so you don't have to go commit crimes to get money to pay for things. And folks get jobs, they stabilize in their relationships. And so I say that is most definitely not one drug for another. So but one of the challenging things is we don't have a treatment like that for methamphetamine. And that is one of the real challenges with how prevalent using methamphetamine is, how severe methamphetamine affects and exacerbates mental illness. We're seeing a marked increase in methamphetamine overdoses in the state as well. And to not have a really effective treatment for that is really challenging, that I can't offer the same thing that I can for someone whose drug of choice is one of the opioids. So we are really lucky to be able to provide care for folks, both for their mental illness and their substance use in the jail. But it is sort of it's kind of like throwing Band-Aids at people while they're passing by, right? And it's nice that I also am connected to places in the community, and I'm mostly a lot of times just trying to be a non-judgmental, friendly face to suggest where there are places to connect when you do release. But especially with high-level mental illness that really requires significant medications to treat, our biggest concern is always where, when, and how can you continue on those medicines? Because we do see some dramatic improvements in folks when they're with us. But it's always that transition of care that is a big deal to coordinate and be concerned about. So there's just not enough resources for inpatient drug and alcohol treatment, inpatient mental illness treatment, where we can't get the intensive level of care they need. And then they're here at the jail and we do the best we can by them. But just knowing that we're falling short on the wraparound services that they really need, but we do the best we can with what we have. And again, I'm very appreciative that the staff at the jail here is very supportive, and it's not like that everywhere. A lot of folks have much more traumatic experiences being involved in the criminal justice system. So that's just kind of a snapshot of my experience of it here. Okay. I don't know if anyone else has other thoughts to add into that, or other tangents I
Well,
should go on?
I think we're ready to go to the questions, but before we do, I would like to add that, and we just got this news today that um, uh, I guess I'll let Wenzel explain, or maybe Dr. Monahan, but we have a grant that actually is kind of open-ended, and we're going to add a case manager that will assist Dr. Monahan and give what we call, I think it's called a warm handoff, where we're actually gonna take folks that we've cleaned up and treated in the jail, as well as prescribing the Suboxone, and I think we're going to start doing Vivitrol, and break that cycle. The biggest, it's almost like in the supply chain, is that last mile. We do wonders with people that are in the jail. They're in great shape, and as Don Wenzel indicated, particularly the homeless or unsheltered or transients, we release them, and where do they go? They go across the street, and within 2 weeks, they're back in jail. So we're real excited about that. Doc, is there anything you can add to that?
No, I think I just found out at the beginning of this meeting that we got the grant, so I'm super excited about it. Expanding treatment for opioid use disorder has so many significant outcomes, between reducing overdose deaths after release from incarceration. I can't remember the statistic off the top of my head, but it is a dramatic increase in overdose risk when you release from jail or prison if you don't have any treatment on board. And it also reduces the reduces the health complications, reduces recidivism. And so the more treatment we can get to people, and this grant will both be able to offer more treatment to the folks who are in need of it. And the big benefit is this case manager who can help connect those dots to community resources getting out of here, rather than just the nurses and I like making frantic phone calls and praying that it happens.
Don may have some questions, follow-up questions for our guests, but also everyone else, if you have a question, you can either put that in the chat or you can use the reaction button and press the raised hand function. And that way you'll pop up on my screen and I can call on you in order. So Don, turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you. I don't have that raised hand function on my screen for whatever reason, but I do have the chat. Anyway, I guess the question that came to me was that the rediscovery program was raised. Could someone talk about that a little bit from your perspective? Are people, social workers, going out with officers when they encounter the homeless, drug addicts or whatever, or is that strictly for when they're released? Are they helping with released prisoners or both?
Brian, why don't you take that?
Yeah, it's on both fronts. It's with the release at the jail, and it's also we are taking rediscovery navigators out into the field with us. We have a rediscovery liaison, Sergeant Amy Bundy, who weekly meets with the rediscovery team, pairs them with deputies, and we go out into the field, into the places that we know where there's, whether it be a homeless encampment or just people that we've encountered over the course of the time, over the course of a week, that are in need. And we reach out and we start to work and bring those resources together. So it's really been positive, as well as in live time, as we get dispatched to calls for service out in the community where we feel that a rediscovery caseworker would be beneficial in bringing a certain event to resolution. They are available to us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We even have folks coming in off the street into the courthouse looking for a warm place to shelter or food. And our first call is to rediscovery. That, gives us more time to focus on our law enforcement function, yet make sure that people are taken care of.
Okay, thank you. That clarifies that. And I'm not sure any other questions. How about let's open it up to some of the rest of you. I guess Matt is able to monitor.
Yeah, Nancy, it looks like Nancy has a question. Go ahead,
I
Nancy.
was just going to remind folks that next week we will have at least 2 members of the rediscovery team with our forum. So stay tuned and you'll hear it from a couple that are on the streets and doing what Brian King was talking about.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question actually too. Are there any movements to help people that are mentally ill that, you know, we were talking, Lindsay, you were talking about the setup back in the 70s that was kind of dismantled, but are there things that are working at a systemic level to help? Where are we in that continuum, I guess? Do you know what I mean?
I'd say we're not where we need to be. One thing that just comes to mind in regards to the homelessness was actually I was meeting with our legislators on Monday. There's a bill or a proposal for Molina, the Medicaid our state has to recognize housing as a health marker. And the significant, you know, we've just this week we saw a 35-year-old homeless guy with frostbite who's probably going to have like chronic foot infections, right, from being homeless, who's not going to, you know, it's going to be this downhill effect of his ability to re-enter the workforce and, you know, live a productive life, right, of something that could be completely prevented with housing. And everyone's probably quite aware of the challenges of housing in the area, but linking Medicaid to housing resources is one of the steps that may be coming along to help increase housing access for folks. In terms of anything coming down the pipe about improving mental health access, I don't know any particulars.
Thanks.
I can add a little to that. What we need is kind of an outpatient, or actually, I'm sorry, an inpatient setup for folks that are mentally ill and who aren't, you know, in the criminal justice system. Unfortunately, we'll have people that are showing markers of distress, and before they can be voluntarily helped, they'll wind up committing a crime, sometimes a serious crime, and now we own them. The problem with that is, of course, you start with NIMBYs. Nobody wants one of those in their backyard, and because of past experiences and whatnot, they tend to be small. I think that for some regulation that they have to be for what we're talking about, it would be no more than 16 beds. But having said that, even a 16-bed facility is incredibly expensive. If it is an inpatient setup, an inpatient facility, it's going to require 24-hour staffing. And depending on the level of the mental illness, some of it might even require security, it might require lockdowns, and there's a fine line with that. But as Dr. Indicated earlier, we do not have mental hospitals like we used to. The only mental hospitals we have are forensic mental hospitals, which to get in them, you must have committed a serious crime. And I hate to say it, but the one we use, Western, is it's terrible. It needs to be torn down. It's I don't know if it's finally been recertified and whatnot, but that isn't what we need. We need these kind of residential or inpatient facilities. There's some talk I'm kind of excited about this. It's a controversial subject, but the Jamestown tribe has enough property to put one on their campus with a MAT clinic. And I think that there's even money that's been earmarked for that. I was at a meeting with Dr. Simkowski on that, but there's some zoning areas and there's a lot of money before we'll see that. But I think that would go in large part to help us. If we have people that are mentally ill that have not committed a crime, basically the only place they can go for mental health treatment, they can't go to our hospital for anything other than evaluation. We have no psychiatric facilities or capabilities at OMC. They basically have to go to Kitsap County to one of the hospitals there. And so you're talking about, oh gosh, a 2-hour ambulance ride and all the costs that are associated with that. So the point is that we rely on our navigators and our DCRs and whatnot to go out, but if it requires inpatient, it's very difficult to do.
I just want to add on to that too, the perspective from like my regular clinic when I have patients who are suicidal or actively psychotic and family members are expressing concern that they might be a harm to themselves or others. There's almost nothing that I can turn to. You can send them to the ER and they often will sit there for days because even in Kitsap, there isn't a bed for them to go to. And then at some point during that time, a mental health evaluator, or they feel better, or they leave and they don't end up getting that bed. And if they do, again, it took days and it's taking up space in the emergency room, right? That we clearly don't have any space right now. Or even same thing when people are really very suicidal and have committed harm to themselves, I still haven't been able to get them inpatient beds. And it's so frazzling as a primary care doctor to be like, what does someone have to do to be hospitalized, and you're just kind of holding your breath, so concerned that something's going to happen to them or they're going to do something to someone else, and that there's just not the space for enough treatment beds for people. So every doctor is like pulling their hair out about it, and it's a big problem. So if the Jamestown tribe were to open an inpatient psychiatric bed, it would be filled instantaneously and constantly.
Thanks.
Okay, yes.
Looks like Martha had a question here, and then Iantha will get to you.
After listening to all your presentations, I just thought, good heavens, what are people's objections to the Jamestown MAT Clinic? So I'd say, is anybody on here can say, other than fear of, that's mostly what you hear, is fear of what having people around that you don't want in your town or something, but it just sounds like, and I know Grace talks about anybody who she has in her treatment place that is psychotic usually has had such trauma, sexual abuse. And so, just the fact that you want to open a facility that tries to give people other treatments to try to heal seems miraculous to me. So.
Yeah, you're right. It's a lot of fear, a lot of stigma. It's the not in my backyard. But if anyone was ever at that forum in Squim, I got up and spoke that when I lived in Missouri for medical school, I lived literally next door to the Methadone Clinic for 4 years. And then in residency in Seattle for 2 years, I lived just a couple blocks from one of the methadone treatment programs. And I literally have 0 stories to tell you of anything that happened. They were lovely neighbors. So
what is the place that is next, the BART facility or next to Horizon?
Yeah,
what is that?
BART is a methadone clinic. It's a for-profit organization that has clinics all over the place. But it has been a big benefit to expanding treatment for folks. There was no methadone available on the peninsula forever until BART came a year, like 2 years ago, maybe. And that was really challenging when treating people with Suboxone. Suboxone works for the vast majority of people, but there are some people that it just isn't going to work for. I always say Suboxone's like taking pills for your diabetes, and that most people with diabetes, that's going to work, but some people got to get on the insulin, right? And so methadone's kind of like the insulin treatment, the kind of this intensive step up. And not having that before was pretty devastating, just like if you didn't have insulin for your diabetics, right? So it's been wonderful to have them in town.
Well, whenever I drive by, since I purposely kind of look around since the whole hubbub with the Jamestown clinic, and it's like you never see anybody hanging out or doing anything there. So
Yeah.
people just, are having a smoke or getting in their car, or you really hardly see anybody when I drive by.
Yeah, I really liked the that SQUIM hearing. There were like people pouring out into the parking lot, and it was huge. And then there was a picture in the paper of the hearing about the one in Port Angeles. It was like 5 people in an empty auditorium. I was like, yeah, Port Angeles, way to go.
Iantha, you had a question? But you'll have to unmute first, Iantha.
We can't hear you, Iantha. Unmute.
This is probably more, I think everything that the county is doing is wonderful, and I give accolades. I'm all for supporting Peninsula Mental Health. But I feel, as a resident of Port Angeles, I live on 2nd Street. I'm right above the zigzag. As Officer Smith said, you are definitely living in the hood. As Bill Benedict explained earlier, they do a lot of trespassing work. I don't know where everybody else lives, but if you live in town, it's very difficult. And underneath the zigzag, about a couple weeks ago, about 200 needles got pulled out. I've seen a really big increase of people that are on the street that are high. And like I had a guy approaching me one day higher than a kite telling me to get out of my house, that the house really was his. We have a park here that we have had to totally strip down, benches out because of the vagrants. And I'm not calling them homeless. They are people with an addiction problem. Another perfect example is we have an elderly couple that live down at the end of the street, and we have a neighborhood watch, and we watched 6 of them moved underneath the deck. So I'm all for the program, so please don't get me wrong, but in the last 10 years living on this street, it's a part-time job. It's the people that are in the drugs, and I wish them all well. It's a very dark world, very dark. There's young girls out there that are prostituting their bodies for the money. I see it go on. Over the last year, I'm seeing people shoot up right in the open now. Before it was something, maybe you'd go find a needle, but they go over to the park and they actually just roll up their sleeves and shoot up. So my question is, I love all these programs. So Lindsay, don't think I'm getting upset about any of that, but what about programs to help us? I
Let me
mean,
address that. Let me take the first whack at that, Ayanta. First of all, I completely I sympathize and empathize. I'm a believer in accountability, and some of the problems that that Port Angeles has to deal with is that we have some unusual legislation that, particularly with this last legislature, that has made holding folks accountable that commit crime a little more difficult. I expect that's going to get better with this legislative session. But honestly, a lot of what you're bringing up, I agree with. I fully support these programs. But first of all, I want to tell you is I don't run law enforcement in the city of Port Angeles. I do outside the city limits. The city has a lot of more problems and constraints that I do. But me, the sheriff, I do not tolerate illegal camping. I don't tolerate aggressive behavior or trespassing in the county. We hook people up with programs, but I think we need to see more of that. And I think that it would probably be good for, if you wanted to carry that discussion on, is to actually have a forum and get the city mayor and the chief of police on to explain. Now, I think they're doing a reasonably good job. I'm not trying to throw them under the bus, but I know the problems that exist there, and people don't feel safe, and perception is reality in that regard. We be fair, firm, and hold people accountable. One of the problems that we have, and the group that we're talking about, those that are involved with the criminal justice system, almost all of them have been trespassed out of a Serenity House. So we're talking about people that really can't go anywhere because of their behavior is so bad, and that's and invariably they wind up in the jail. I would say this, and the doctor will agree with me: if we can get these folks out of this cycle, it's going to help you, because they're the ones that are problematic.
I think it's a symptom, just an excellent demonstration of this cycle that goes on, where we don't have enough treatment resources, community resources, to break that cycle for enough people. But I also don't want this to be all doom and gloom. This is something that I get to see in my clinic that the folks in the jail don't get to see, is I get to see the people who do break out of those cycles, right? I've got women whose pregnancies we diagnosed in the jail, we treated them, I delivered their babies, they're raising them, right? Like, there are these success stories. There's just not enough resources to help everyone break out of that cycle.
and I wish them all well. It's a very sad world to watch, where, like I said, where I live, it's 24/7. People under the zigzag, under the steps, underneath your own home. And like I said, it's really a sad, dark, dark world. It's just kind of frustrating when you're on the receiving end of it. People, I can get in their cars and go away from downtown Port Angeles. But if you are a resident here, and my perspective of them has not changed at all. I mean, I'm a big supporter of PBH. I live across the street from a PBH house. I help them. I do everything that I can. But these people are high, and they are criminals, and they pack weapons. I mean, these are some pretty serious people. And I also think that the perception that people get is not going to help getting more mental health, because people don't understand. And all
And
the
I'm
things.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna interrupt for a second. I'm curious, do we have some statistics available as far as the homeless population? I know we talked a little bit about that, but in terms of how many people might be former inmates or you know, criminals, what kind of statistics do we have?
Well, I can go back. I'm actually a year out of date on that. I'm fairly familiar with the point and count time from 2 years ago, from 2020. I don't think that 21 has come out yet. There's the majority, not necessarily the vast majority, but the majority of our homeless that we deal with, and I can only talk to the ones we deal with, are residents of our community. They grew up here, or they came here when they were kids, or that they were working. There is a significant number that do come in from out of town, and we're seeing that with a whole other category of problems. We're seeing folks like that come in with broken down RVs, some that will camp up at the Deer Park rest area or other areas in the county. Some of those RVs are locals, but some are folks from out of town, and that's going to be an increasing problem. But the fact of the matter is that first of all, I want to dispel this. There's not busloads of homeless people coming from Seattle, number one. Number two, there are not people that are coming here from other areas because they think that that what we offer the homeless is better than they can get where they're at. As a matter of fact, we were discussing that today. If you want to be homeless and you want to get the max benefits you can get, you want to be homeless in Seattle. They get far more free stuff than what we do. So as I said, it's a real mixed bag, and one thing that frustrates me is that Dr. Monahan, she alludes to, we do have some successes. We also have way too many failures, but for every success, it seems like someone else shows up to take their place. And I don't know, from that 30,000 foot view, what's going to happen. I don't think that the housing shortages that we have and the expense in our county are contributing to the homeless that we see. The folks, it's complicated. We see people they're almost all males, a few females, they're almost all males. They're a lot of them are in their mid-20s, late 30s, and some of them older. We have a lot of veterans that have strange tales. A lot of our veterans come out with some kind of a disability discharge, or they were hurt and that got them introduced to Oxycontin, and then it spirals out of control. So it's a real mixed bag, but I don't think it's very conducive in terms of trying to say, well, if we could just stop them from coming in. We have plenty of our own, and it's still that our country, we don't limit people to travel, nor do we limit people from coming in and wanting to use benefits. So does that answer your question, kind of?
Yeah, thank you. We're running short on time. Stan, it looked like you had a question.
I guess, Brian, I'm not sure if you can answer it, but I think you said that the United States has more drug addiction problems than any other country in the world.
Well, yeah, we're the strongest, we're the largest consumer of illicit drugs.
Why do you think that is? Any ideas?
If you ask me, I think we're a spoiled country. And I think it has to do with the fact that we are very spoiled. And just like material things that we have in our country, and that we are consumers of a lot of material goods, I also believe that contributes to that. It contributes, just it's based on our society. And so I think we've allowed ourselves to you know, and this is Brian King's view of the world,
That's
but I think
fine.
we're
That's
very, a very material society. We consume a lot of the world's products, and I think that that's where it gets us. You know, where most of our drugs are coming from are from Mexico, and they know that we're going to use them here. And so they profit on that market.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, it is about time to cut it off. I guess I would like to just kind of sum up or emphasize a little what I think the sheriff said, that the 16-bed facility would be very expensive. And that's part of the problem, is politics. And this problem's just not close enough to the surface to generate enough pressure on the politicians to set aside the money for it. We're into a small government, low tax sort of mode in Olympia to some extent anyway. And trying to deal with this problem would be, or is, really expensive. So with that note, you might, if you're concerned, talk to your representatives about it at whatever level. And in 2 weeks, we will have the mayor and city manager and get the more of the politicians' take on the problem. So with that, I would like to thank all 4 of our presenters so much for coming and sharing with us. I really appreciate it, and I think everyone does. So thank you. And with that, I think we'll say good night.
See you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.